Thank you so much for joining me, Emily, for this interview for the Smithsonian's American Women's History Museum. Today is August 22nd, 2024. My name is Rachel Seidman, and I'm really delighted to be here interviewing you. Would you mind, please, just introducing yourself? Just say your name and whatever title or how you'd like to be identified.
Well, I'm Emily Card. I have a PhD, so it's always nice to be called doctor, but for this interview, let's go with Emily. And I'm glad to be here.
All right. Well, it's wonderful to have you. We should note that we are doing this interview long distance over Zoom. I'm in Washington, D.C., and Ms. Card, Dr. Card, Emily is in California. We are so grateful that you made this time to be with us and to take the time and energy to share what is really an amazing story. You I know, played a key part in an important policy moment in women's history, the passage of the Equal Opportunity Credit Act. But before we get to that story, I really want to understand some about your earlier life and how you got on that path that led you to play that critical role and that shaped your ideas about women and financial independence. So let's start with your childhood and your family. What can you tell me about your parents and where you grew up?
Well, I grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is very close to Georgia. And I was really thinking back about how I got to this point about caring about credit and women and money. And I realized that actually I didn't start in the right place in my thinking previously. It's actually started way back when I was an undergraduate at Newcomb College and I was selected to get a Ford Foundation Fellowship to go as a graduate student to Ghana.
Hmm.
And there I saw the power of the market women who had pulled off a boycott in 1951, which led to internal self rule for Ghana, which was in the Gold Coast. And I never had realized that women could start toppling a colonial power. But when I was a little girl, the whole map was pink for British Empire. And Ghana was one of the key places that got independence early and led to the rest of Africa getting it. So that was a kind of a lead in point that I had almost forgotten about. But after being in Africa twice, I came back to, where did I go to? Oh, Columbia University, yes, to get my PhD. And um, there I didn't involve myself in this issue, but I was concerned about equal rights for women, period. I remember when they first gave money to the spouses of people that had these fellowships like I had, the women had to prove that their husbands did not provide money, whereas the husbands got the money automatically. So that was another point where I noticed the difference in the trail for women and men. Finally, as I was growing up, though, as a really young person, I was very concerned about the fact that I was forced to work in my father's drugstore. And I called the labor department, I think it must have been the Tennessee Labor Department, and asked them, could I be forced to work at 7 years old? And they told me yes, it was a family business, I could be. And I was really discouraged because I had expected a different answer. And from there, I also got to thinking about my mother. Now, it's odd because my grandmothers both had more money control than my mother did. My grandmothers, I guess you might have said that they came with almost like a dowry because my maternal grandmother was always self sufficient economically as much as I could see. And my paternal grandmother was a farmer and she married late, so she came to the wedding with a skill set not like usually you'd find with a urban family. And my own mother, though, never had a checkbook until she got divorced after 30 years of marriage. So that was a picture that I did not want to see again in my life. And I was very adamant about that.
So, do you mind? Can you tell me more about what you noticed about your mother's experience? How old were you when that divorce happened?
I was already way grown. I was in the 40s. They had married, they stayed married for a good, complete 30 years. But as we were untangling her life, I realized how little actual agency she had over her own life. and I hadn't really thought about it as much as I did when I saw what was going on there. That was more or less, I can't remember exactly what year they divorced, but it was around the time I was doing this work. So it led me deeper into the question. My mama didn't have a checking account. She didn't have a credit card. She did have credit cards that said Mr. Ray Dean Watts that we were allowed to use. They didn't say Mrs. Ray Dean Watts. They said Mr. And those were for local department stores, which I used it liberally to buy things that I needed, like cloth to sew on. And then I'd hide the bills till the next bill cycle so Daddy wouldn't notice, supposedly. I'm sure he did notice, but he never mentioned it. But I was the oldest child also, so I had a lot of freedom compared to my siblings in the fact that I could get away with stuff like that.
So was the checkbooks, that she didn't have a checkbook, was that something she talked with you about, or you just noticed that or figured it out?
No, I noticed it because she asked, basically got basic ideas from us, not just me, but also my other two sisters, about what she needed to do as she was going through this whole. It was a year-long process, and I don't think she thought about it a lot when she was married. Actually, not having a checkbook, because we called every week and got money from the drugstore to come home for the groceries and stuff like that. But everything had to be doled out, item by item and need by need. So usually on Friday night we'd call and get ice cream and money, which is a little different than having the ability to actually write checks.
You had to explain what you were going to spend the money on?
Generally speaking, yeah, you'd say groceries or not clothes, because for clothes we went to a shop my father knew the owner of, and we went there twice a year. We got clothes.
Mm-hmm.
We had Daddy liked to run a tribe type feeling.
He did what?
He ran a tribe. He liked to go with all of us to the store and see what clothes we were buying, that kind of thing. They would close the store up the night we would come.
Mm-hmm. So when you were growing up, would you say was money and financial independence a topic of conversation that you talked about as a family? What were the messages you got as a child about that?
That's a really good question. I think it wasn't a discussed topic at all, but I was I was very aware of finances. I actually decided in my sophomore year in high school that I wanted to write a column for the local newspaper, and my need for doing that was not writing. It was the fact that I found out you get paid $5 a week for your column, which at that time was actually a lot of money. It'd be more like up that 30 at 40 now. And I did this column in in one of the local newspapers once a week. There were two papers in our town, and sometimes I did an extra column if I needed more money, and they would take it. They didn't seem to care, so I was careful not to overdo that. But I learned by example more than by anything that was ever discussed. I don't think it was ever discussed. Mother discussed how much money she needed or what we wanted to call for. And of course, sometimes she would call, but a lot of times that was left to me or Judy, my sister.
Hmm. What about, do you think, what kinds of messages do you remember absorbing about women and money from just watching or even from popular culture back then? Would you say, like when you were coming of age, what were your sort of expectations about money and yourself?
Oh my. Uh, it's really hard to think back to being that age. I don't know, except for the fact that I was very determined to be in control of my own life, including the money aspect of it. I will tell you what happened when I started to go to college, because that kind of gives a big picture story. I was determined to go to one of the sister schools in the Ivy League, and nobody in Chattanooga had ever gone to one at that point. And I applied to Harvard, Radcliffe. At that time, Radcliffe was separate. Wellesley, and Mount Holyoke. I didn't know about all of them, or didn't know to apply to all of them. And I got in. I got on the waiting list for Radcliffe. I got admitted to Wellesley and Mount Holyoke, but I did not get any financial aid, and I was really discouraged about that. But I had been sent a letter from Tulane University, the women's college is Newcomb, or was Newcomb, and they offered me a scholarship if I decided to come there, just based on my scores on the national merit exam. I was a finalist, and my father told me to go ahead and apply for that, which of course I knew what would be the dreadful outcome. I would end up getting the money and have to go there, and sure enough I did. But it turned out to be good after all. I got a complete scholarship. I was able to go to England my sophomore year. I graduated in 3 years, and from there on I was supported by fellowships up until I graduated. So I was really very fortunate because it was a good experience. But at the time I was just horrified, and I begged Daddy to sell some land. We had some farmland. I said, can he just sell a few acres so I could go to Wellesley? That's what I wanted to do. And he said, I begged him, and he said, no, there's 3 other children that have to be educated, so you have to take this scholarship. So I took it. But that was one of the examples of when I really understood how much I could have happened, how my life would have been different, but it wasn't because of money.
Where do you think that ambition came from as a young person to go to an Ivy League?
I have no idea. I can't even understand how I ever heard of them, but I knew somehow. I really don't know where I got that idea. I don't remember finding it. But I used to read a lot. I read everything, and I went to the library and read different categories of things. So probably I ran across it in a book.
Yeah. Well, you must have been a very good student.
I don't know. I was a good reader. I was a good student, but I wasn't always as consistent as I might have been. But I did well enough.
What was your first job?
Besides the drugstore, I worked in the drugstore when I was a kid.
But did you get your own, did you get paid for that? Did you get
25 cents an hour.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, I was the only person that got paid that amount. My siblings didn't.
What did you do there?
Well, I did everything. I waited on the front door. We had boys from the Macaulay School for Boys come in, and that was always thrilling. For example, Ted Turner was one of the boys that came in. We all knew who he was because of his father. I was a soda jerk. I knew how to do the cooking. We had a complete fountain with tons of food. And I also helped when I was older, I helped with Daddy in the pharmacy. I knew how to count pills out and stuff like that.
Wow, that's great. Well, do you remember? Okay, so let's go back to this. It's hard to recall the coming of age, like what you were thinking about as you
I was
were
thinking about boys.
Boys. Were you
and clothes.
expecting to marry and have a family? And
I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking about the dance I was going to Saturday night.
Yeah.
Honestly, I didn't think at all about getting married.
Okay. But you did at some point get married, right?
But I graduated from college and spent how many years? 2 or 3 years after college, I got married. In those days, everybody wanted to be married by their senior year, or at least engaged.
Right. And who was this? Someone you met at college?
It was somebody I met the first week of college who turned out to be from Chattanooga, where I was from, but we had never met before, even though he was at the very school I had gone to with the dances, the Baylor School for Boys. At that time it was called. Now it's the Baylor School. And we met because somebody met us during the course of Rush Week for the sororities and fraternities, and they had learned that we were both from Chattanooga and kind of hooked us up on that basis. Not necessarily for a date, but just because we were might be friends. And I met him the first week of college, and then it was a 5-year period before we ever got married.
And I think I saw somewhere that you had a son.
That was from my second marriage.
Your second marriage.
My husband and I had a son. Okay. I mean, he's still alive.
Okay. So after you got married, was the PhD program before or after that?
I started at Columbia in '64, and I wasn't married that year, but my husband, or my soon to be husband, was. We weren't engaged. He came to New York and was doing something different. Um, and in '65, the summer of '65, we got married. Then he came with me to Ghana the second time I went, which was nice.
It's not that common for women to have gotten a PhD in 1965.
No, it wasn't. Actually, we were 10% of the graduate program, but I was told later, I didn't know this, they did not expect any woman that came for a master's degree to ever get a PhD. So we were really an exception, and I had a really hard time getting a thesis sponsor because of that very problem. I finally ended up with a fantastic sponsor, Emmanuel Wallerstein, who's a very famous sociologist who just died recently. But I didn't know any of those facts at that time. I just kept going ahead, doing what I thought I had to do, and I learned from two other women and then the men that I knew what the steps I was supposed to take would be. And that's how I knew what to do, because they didn't give a roadmap for us at all. In fact, I had an African studies teacher who said, I went in to see him about getting a fellowship to go do my PhD research, and he said, well, I'm sorry, but the Ford Foundation won't give research fellowships to unmarried women. And that was in '64. And I went back in '65 and I said, well, I'm married now, so I want to get a Ford Foundation fellowship. And he said, no, they won't give money to people that are married. And I said, well, why didn't you tell me this before? And I said, you told me I had to be married to get one. So it was just that same circle that people kept you running around the mulberry bush, as they say.
Hmm. So how did you get a grant or something to go to Ghana?
I had one the whole time. I mean, I didn't understand. I wasn't aware that I could have the money when I left to go to Ghana. But I found out when I knew that I couldn't get a foundation fellowship, which I had Ford before. See, they had supported my first visit to Africa. So, but it was through Tulane, not directly. They sent a person to interview me and talk to me about what research I was planning to do. But you could go back. What was I talking about?
I was just trying to understand. You didn't get the Ford Fellowship to go to Ghana.
Right. Got it. Okay. I had a National Defense Foreign Language Fellowship, which they don't have anymore. It was something that Fulbright thought up, and it was a 4-year fellowship for graduate school. So as long as you kept your grades up, you could count on having that money. And I didn't know that I could have it abroad, but I found out if I had paid the tuition at Columbia with the fellowship, they would also give me the stipend that went with it, and that was enough to go to Africa on at that time. So that's what we did.
So while you were getting this PhD, was your assumption that you would become an academic?
Yes. At that time, the jobs for women were teacher, secretary, which would not be a college person, and what else?
Nurse.
Well, that wasn't a college track either. I guess there was basically teacher was the only thing coming out of a graduate program. So yes, I thought I'd go teach at Harvard. And then when we ended up going to LA, I said, oh, it's too bad we're going to be in Los Angeles because there's no schools there except UCLA. That was my theory. That was my point of view. So I was rudely awakened later when I found out UCLA didn't hire women yet in their political science department. I ended up getting a job with the University of California at Irvine, and also one at Riverside, the UC at Riverside. And that was a whole nother topic.
Okay. So then what made you decide, because you applied at some point to become a legislative fellow with Senator Brock?
Correct. Well,
so what spurred that decision?
I saw an ad for this fellowship in a journal, and I thought it sounded interesting. And I was a political scientist, and they had mentioned political science as one of the options. Also, I was in a cold environment when I made the decision, and I decided I didn't want to be that cold. So that was both the enticement of going to Washington and the fear of being cold all the time led me to apply. And then I went for an interview in the office of Senator Brock, and I had to wear a dress. Somebody told me beforehand that I better wear a dress. Sure enough, I was in the only dress I had, which was giving false advertising, because when I got there for the job, I didn't have any dresses, and I wore pants to the office. There was a no pants policy both in the office and in the floor of the Senate. So I came to work with the wrong clothes, but anyway, they seemed to let me do that after a while.
All right. So I want to ask you something before that. You mentioned in your book that I forget something went against your feminist grain. So I want to ask you about your feminist grain and what you meant by that. When you were in college and graduate school, were you aware of, involved in feminist organizing, or like, were you reading Ms. Magazine? Were you actually did you see yourself, did you identify as a feminist at that time?
We didn't call it feminist then. We called it women's liberation or women's liber. Now, you have to remember, Ms. didn't come out to 1972, and I was doing all this in the 60s. So, yes, it sort of bubbled to the surface, but it took time. I remember at UC Riverside, there was an anti-Vietnam protest, or anti-Vietnam War protest, and there were 3 graduate students and 1 faculty member that were all men. And I went up and said, "Why don't you have a woman speak?" And they said, "Well, why don't you speak?" And I said, "Well, I've never done any public speaking." So I ended up speaking that day, and probably it was the beginning of when I started to really think about this issue. Later on, I did have some meetings at my home in Orange County, California, for what I call the women's, I forgot what we called it exactly, something like Progressive Women's Group or some generic name. And about 70 women from all over Southern California came. And that was a really good organizing experience, because the people were out on the porch talking all over different rooms. And
Was
people
that-
still remember that.
Was that a sort of consciousness raising group type of?
Probably it was more than consciousness. By that time, that was 1970 when we had that meeting. We'd gotten beyond consciousness raising and into talking about issues. But I did go to some consciousness raising groups, but I graduated quickly to the issues group.
Mm-hmm. So what were those women, did any actions come out of those meetings?
Well, that was just one meeting. We didn't form an organization at that point. Later on, very soon thereafter, there was the National Women's Political Caucus was formed, and some of the women from that meeting went to that. Some of the ones that came to that meeting might have been in Now. I don't remember what year Now started. I think it was a little before that. But this meeting, basically, we didn't try to track what people did. We just had the meeting and let the energy go out from there.
That's really interesting. So, okay, so I remember reading, and about an experience you had. I think it was trying to get a car loan. Was that, or get
Credit card.
a credit card? Yeah. Remind me when that was.
Well, that was 1970, the same year we had this meeting. So I
Okay.
think it might have been before the meeting, actually, that I applied for a card from it was called the Bank America card. I was a customer at Bank of America, so I thought, they sent me a solicitation, and I thought this is something I should do, not really knowing much about credit cards, but I applied for it, and I was turned down. They sent me a letter back saying that I could not have a card in my own name, but if I wished for my husband to apply, he could. So I was really upset, and I wrote a letter back and tried to get them to give me a card, but they wouldn't. Eventually, we got one in his name, and I think maybe I got an extra card or something. I don't really recall. But I was totally stunned by that, because my husband was a graduate student at that point, and I was a professor or a lecturer at the University of California, and I thought that should be enough. So I thought, I thought surely my salary, which at that time was around, I think it was either 15 or 17,000, I can't remember, but it was a good salary for that time period. uh, was not enough. But he was able to get a card. He did have some resources, but I later learned that California community property law at that time was different than it is now. And at that time, I think the men controlled the whole community, and the women could not control it. And now it's either spouse can commit the entire community for a credit purpose, which means you could be 200% overdrawn.
Right. All right. So now, is there anything else about those early days before you started working for Senator Brock that you want to be part of the story or part of the record?
Well, the only other thing that of note that happened about that was I got a interest in buying a house, which I bought. I was in Wisconsin, which was not a community property state, and I decided to buy a house. And in order to do that, I decided before I started that I would have an attorney on board. And I got an attorney, a local attorney, who helped me make the application for a mortgage, and I was able to get that mortgage. But again, the laws were different in that state. In Wisconsin, they had fairly liberal laws at that time, and it's a common law state, which means each person can control a certain amount of the income.
Were you
So I did
married at that?
Still married to the same husband.
Okay. But the
Yeah.
mortgage was in your name.
Well, yes, it was. In fact, they didn't even have to ask me about my husband in that situation, because I already told the attorney all that had happened, and we went at it a different way. I didn't put his name down. I didn't lie or anything. I just didn't put his name or income.
Mm-hmm. Because you didn't want to have the same experience you'd had with the credit card?
Let's just say I learned from that experience.
Okay. Okay. So then you got the Senate fellowship, became a Senate fellow. And what year? This was 1973 that you arrived?
Correct. I arrived on January 2nd, 1973.
Okay. And how much did you know about Senator Brock at that time?
Well, he was from Chattanooga, so I knew a lot about him or his family. I used to swim in his grandmother's swimming pool, which was near our house, and she was a grand old dame who everybody knew about. And I didn't know a lot about Bill Brock himself, but I did know he was a Republican, and he was the first Republican elected to Congress since the Reconstruction. So I knew he was an unusual person. I was not a Republican or a Democrat. I thought I was a Marxist that day.
That day?
Yeah, well, it didn't last too long. It actually, by the time I left the Senate, I knew I was a Democrat, because we had discussed that. He and I had discussed that question. But basically, I knew he was a Republican. I knew when I met him, he was really polite and seemed like a really nice person. And that's about all I really knew. I found out more, of course, very quickly.
Mm-hmm. So tell me about arriving on your first day of work, or, what it was like when you started there.
Okay, well, the thing that stood out the first day was there was a press release in my mailbox. We already had a mailbox when we arrived, and it said that it was about the National Commission on Consumer Finance, which had held hearings the year before, and the report had been issued, and there was a press release about the report that had one line. It said, "Women are having trouble getting access to credit, according to our witnesses," something along that line. And I saw that in the release, and I immediately asked. Somebody came up to me and said, "Emily, don't plan to do that. You don't need to be involved in that issue." And I said, "Why not?" He didn't know. This man was very nice, but he didn't have any idea what I'd already experienced. So I asked the senator, I said, "Could I work on this?" And he said, well, he didn't know what there was to work on. I said, well, he was on that commission. That's why he got the release. And so he was already aware there was could be a problem. It wasn't really that extensively covered in that commission, just a few pages. So Senator Brock said he wasn't sure if we needed that. And I said, well, I had experience being turned down for credit. He knew that I was married and, had a husband that earned money by that point. So he said, why don't you think about it and come back and talk to me about it? Because that was just the beginning of the time I was working there. Um, at some point, fairly soon, I went in and asked him again. Before that, though, I'd gone to the bank to open a checking account, and I noticed that there was a sign on the wall about equal housing lending, and I called the number on the thing on the wall and asked the man that answered, could he please tell me why they weren't including sex in this discrimination notice? He said, well, it's not in the law. And he said, are you calling from Senator Brock's office? I said, yes. I told him I was with Senator Brock's office, but he couldn't believe I was calling him. And he said, well, you could do something about that. And I heard that information. So that went along. I didn't think about that either much. But by the time I got into my work, a couple of weeks into it, I realized that this was an issue I could really work on. So I also, at the same time, I had gotten an issue of Ms. Magazine, which was now out on the newsstands, and it said what the 93rd Congress can do for you. And there was an article by a woman named Ellen Sudo that told us we could get equal credit or get credit rights in that year.
So how do you spell pseudo?
SUDOW.
Okay.
She was a writer. I don't know if she's still around or not. I haven't thought about that in a while. But she was very nice. I called her actually right away and said, can you tell me more about this article? So we met for lunch very quickly, and she briefed me on what she knew about it. And from there, I had got a grasp of some of the issues I'd need to address in a memo to Senator Brock. So I made a short memo addressing the issues. And then after that, we got to work on more stuff, which I'll tell you about in a minute.
Okay. That's a great story about the reading that in Ms. Magazine and the wall, the sign on the wall. And
it's amazing, really.
Yeah.
How you can go around and look at things and get something done if you pay attention.
Yeah, it is. It's amazing. So Senator Brock, I read something that Senator Brock wrote in which he mentions this story about how you talked to him about this, and he said that he underestimated your network and that within 6 weeks you had 10,000 pieces of mail from women explaining how they'd been denied credit.
Really? Where did he write that? I never saw this.
I'll send it to you.
What's it in? Do you know?
I forget. It was
Oh, I think I know. It was the Department of Labor. He was the Secretary of Labor, and they were celebrating the Women's Labor Bureau of Women's Labor Statistics or something.
Maybe. I'll send you what.
Because I know a friend of mine went to a meeting that he read something about me, but I never knew exactly what it was.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So, what is he talking about? How did you get 10,000 letters in 6 weeks?
I don't think that's really exactly what happened, but
okay.
We got a lot of letters, but it wasn't 10,000 in 6 weeks. But probably he was thinking about the magnitude of the activity that sort of bubbled up almost immediately. Right after I had given him an initial memo, I gave him a longer 25-page discussion of how women weren't getting credit, about all of the statistics about women working more now. Because at that time, the majority of women weren't working yet in the labor force and paid labor. And also most mothers did not work, but increasingly women with children were entering the workforce. So I gave him all the statistics that we now all know about. And then I gave the examples of reasons women couldn't get credit. And when he saw that paper, after he read it, he said, well, he was sure there was a problem, but he didn't know if a federal law was needed. He thought it could be a states' right issue. That sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Mm.
But I said, no, it won't work that way because the banks are controlled nationally. Even though banks were individually located in regions, the legislative or legal framework for banks was national, like the FDIC and the Fed and so forth. So I said, we have to have a national law. And he said, well, how can we do that? And I told him I thought the Commerce Clause would cover it, which it did, of course. Basically, I think I had started talking to a bunch of different women's groups by then. Not the groups, but the individual leaders. And he's probably referring to all the different people that started sending information about this problem to him and other people.
Who were some of the leaders that you remember talking to?
Well, there was a woman from Now named Sharon Campbell, who had a whole drawer full of letters. She had 3,000 letters that she had gathered up from a Now Credit project. There was women at the Legal Rights Fund, Women's Legal Rights Fund. They had done a study, and they actually did a larger one later on this problem. Probably I talked to the National Women's Political Committee. I talked to different groups, heads of groups that might not exist anymore, but then there were fledgling groups. There was a woman named Carol Burris on the Hill that had a group of her own that she had started. I met Ann Zill along the way. She was connected to the fellowship that program at the Senate or the Congress. I'm not sure which. I guess it was the Senate. So I was sort of networking around all over the place. And those different people, I even remember walking down the street with 5 women, and one of them was Eleanor Holmes Norton. And then there were other women, and somebody made the joke that if we all crossed the street at once, the women's movement in Washington would get killed. So it was a pretty tight-knit small group that was wandering around doing stuff.
That's neat. What was the other person I'm interested in knowing more, and you mentioned her in your book, is Bella Abzug. What was the connection? Did you have a relationship with her? Did you, I know, well, can you say more about her work on the issue and the relationship between that and your work on it?
That's a great point. Bella was an amazing person, and she has to be given credit for the things she did, including working on this issue. The problem that Bella had was that she didn't understand or didn't want to understand the fact that she wasn't on the banking committee in the House. So it'd be hard for her to get the bill brought to the floor, much less passed. And also she was perceived, as an agitator, which she was, but that was a good thing from one point of view, but she wasn't necessarily the person that would get the credibility for this kind of issue. So basically, Bella had introduced some bills at the end of that commission I mentioned before, the National Commission on Consumer Finance. She had introduced some bills in the Congress, 2 bills in the House, which were intended to promote equal credit, and they were good bills, but they weren't totally complete the way they were written. And I talked to the woman who wrote them, and she and I discussed what should be done next. And she was very nice about telling me I should go ahead and do the work if I could. And so,
what was her name? Do you remember?
I don't remember her name, unfortunately. That's been a long time ago. Her name might have been Josephine, but I just can't remember exactly who I know I picture her, but I can't remember her name. But anyway, she was very nice. And just on the point of Bella, basically I kept in touch with Bella's office through this whole process. I didn't really know Bella before this, and I had met her briefly, but when I really got to know her was after the Senate made the passage of the bills in the middle of July. I went to some kind of event in Bella's office, and she came up to me and she sort of really started yelling at me and said, "You're going to give a man all the credit for this instead of a woman." And I said, "Well, I'm sorry, but this is the way it was." But she was really upset about that. Then I saw her later during the Billie Jean King, Bobby Riggs tennis match broadcast. That was in September, and she was friendly by then, so she had gotten over it. She wasn't a person that would hold grudges. So later on, she actually took me to lunch before I left Washington, and we had a nice conversation. For a while, though, I was dating somebody that ended up drowning in the Easter break, and we were on vacation, and that person drowned, but he worked for Bella, so he was using my car to drive Bella to meetings. I had a nice car, and I don't know if Bella ever knew that was my car or not. I just know that my car took her to a lot of meetings. I learned a lot about Bella from that experience.
Well, I'm sorry for that loss. That must have been difficult.
It was very difficult, but it just gave me I think I used the grieving period that I didn't have yet to use all the energy towards working on equal credit because I didn't have other distractions.
Mm-hmm. So you wrote the 25, you wrote the memo, and then you did more research and you wrote the 25-page paper, and you convinced him that a national bill was going to be needed. Can you just tell me more? As you know, I don't never written a bill. So what was the experience of actually writing legislation like?
Well, this legislation, when it was written the first time, was pretty simple. It was just a couple of sentences about not discriminating against women on account of sex or marital status. They didn't use the term gender back then. In the issuing of credit opportunity, they always wanted to say Opportunity Act because they didn't want to say that women should just automatically get credit, so it had to say Opportunity, Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And I don't remember exactly the details of writing it, except that I know that I worked through a member of the Senate Banking Committee staff who helped me. He and I worked together all the time. And then I went with the whole Banking Committee staff and met to discuss this whole thing and what we were trying to do. We have to get those people on board to do a bill. And I guess if there was any language that needed changing, it got changed, but I don't think there was much change at this stage of things. The next year in the House, there were more people that got on board and got involved. But in the Senate framework, there was just the Banking Committee staff, then the Banking Committee itself, which I also went to with the senator. And at that committee, oddly enough, just so you see how writing a bill goes, the people that you would expect would have supported the bill was Alan Cranston, the senator from California. And his staff member said he wasn't in support of it at all. And sure enough, he wasn't very supportive, but he ended up letting it pass through the committee. He said, "Do we have to do this now?" And Bill Brock said, "We have to do it today." I remember that so distinctly. And then also the senator from Louisiana, he had a better point because Louisiana has a Napoleonic law and it doesn't allow for women to control resources the way women can in other places. And he was worried about that issue. I think Louisiana has also revised its law, but it's still a little harder there for women. Anyhow, that's what you do when you write a bill. You talk to a lot of other people.
Mm-hmm. And I'm just curious, were there, excuse me, other women staffers that you were friendly with? Was there any kind of camaraderie among women staffers on the Hill?
You're bringing up an important point. There were women staffers in every office, but usually they were either press secretaries, secretaries to the member or senator, or in some other capacity not equal to being a fellow or being a legislative assistant or an administrative assistant. In the Senate, and the administrative assistants are the key political person in the office. They're the top person, and the legislative assistant just does legal stuff. So when we got around to working on this bill in terms of bringing it to the floor, the thing I had to do was call all of the women who work for other people and get them to help me.
So another person I wanted to ask you about and how she figured into all of this was Lindy Boggs.
Oh, yeah. Lindy Boggs, she figures in a lot of ways. First of all, she graduated from the same college that I did, Newcomb College at Tulane. At that time, we didn't call it at Tulane. We just said Newcomb College, and everybody knew what that was. And she graduated many, many years before me, but she became a congresswoman when her husband, Congressman Boggs, was killed in an airplane crash. And in a true Louisiana fashion, the wife got to fill out the term, but she ended up getting elected in her own right. Now, fast forward to when the bill was on the House side, which was the next year after I was there. Lindy Boggs was one of the key people involved. Now, I have read Lindy's statement about somehow filling in the words of sex and marital status, but I don't know where she got that from. I'm not sure what she was talking about. I don't think it was the actual passage of the bill. I think it was before that. But whatever it was, it definitely was not an intentional thing to leave it out, because the woman that chaired the committee was Martha Griffiths, and she wouldn't have let that happen. So I'm not sure what Lindy was thinking of. But anyway, when I gave my papers to Newcomb to be in their archive, Lindy Boggs came and did the dedication, which was very nice. Before that, she was also the ambassador to Rome, which was a big deal.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I was trying to figure, I saw that statement in her obituary, and I was trying to figure out what that meant, because I wondered if maybe she was she still in office in 1976 when they were doing, when they expanded it to cover race and other things. I wondered if maybe at that point they forgot to keep in the
It could
sex
be.
and marital
It could be
status.
that, yeah. I don't really know. It didn't make sense to me when I read the same obituary that you did. I don't know how I got into it. Oh, I searched on ECOA and Emily Card, and a bunch of different articles came up. I was really surprised. I didn't know there were any articles, and I saw that obituary somehow or another that got in that same batch. I don't know what she was talking about, but probably whatever it was, I'm sure there was not an intention to change the law. That by then there was too much support for it, and also the Fed had already issued a regulation to control the thing. Plus, Jimmy Carter was aware. I worked on a task force for the Carter campaign, and it later became for the president, about equal credit. So he knew about it, and I'm sure that information was in his, in his briefings.
What, so in your own mind, looking back, what do you think were the strengths and the weaknesses of the bill?
I don't know of any weaknesses particularly, because it was going to be the Fed that would write the regulatory framework, something that now has been questioned in our Supreme Court about agencies writing the framework. But in those days, everybody assumed that the Congress could not write regulations. They were right. That would be ridiculous. There's just not enough people in Congress to do that, as far as the staff goes, and not to mention the members. So the bill was just simple. It said what it needed to say, and then the regulations would have to be issued by not just the Fed, but also each different office overseeing federal money. Federal office overseeing money would be having people staffing those positions, and they would also do other things to add to the enforcement.
So if there are any critiques or whatever of the ECOA, it's really about the regulations that came from the Fed. I mean, that the sort of lack of, because I've read some people said that, it didn't have strong enough teeth or whatever, but that's really about the regulations.
Well, yeah, but I will say that, some people could say, why didn't you include race and so forth then? And the question didn't appear to be correct, because at that point, people thought, probably incorrectly, or obviously incorrectly, that it was covered under the HUD Act, which had the notice in the bank that I had noticed, the Equal Housing Lender Bank notice. And I also got Senator Brock to add sex to that language also. So that law was amended at the same time. Nobody ever talked about that very much. But also another thing people didn't talk about, which some people realized, was that was the first gay rights legislation, because it said marital status. For the first time, women that wanted to buy houses together, men that wanted to buy houses together could do that, and they did, but it was never discussed. It was just something that happened. Nobody's ever even written about it, as far as I know.
That's really interesting.
Well, it is interesting, but I think a lot of things happen, and not everybody understands all that's going on. I certainly never thought of that. I just thought of it in terms of my own experience, but later I understood it.
How did you come to understand it?
Oh, just the march of history. Plus, I know people that are gay that are having in same-sex marriages at this point in our history.
So at the time, though, did you know, like, were there stories about two women buying houses together or anything, or it's just something you noticed years later?
Well, I learned that a couple of women bought houses together, but I didn't assume they were gay or not gay. I didn't think about it really. That wasn't an issue that was top of mind at that point in life.
Yeah. Um, what was the reaction when it passed? Were there big, feminist celebrations? Was there what happened?
I don't know. I really don't know. I know that um, going back to the day it passed the Senate, I know that it was on the front page of the New York Times, and I went and tried to look that particular issue up on the Times website lately, and I found out that they have a different article than the one that I saw that next day. It has a whole article about all that the states were doing to have equal rights, credit rights for women, and all that was being done everywhere and everywhere, just all over the place. And I think that article was from later because it was talking about women's organizations. None of that stuff was on the table that day, and I think that article just got people in retrospect thought that all happened that same day, but it didn't. That day it was just that it passed, period. And Bella getting mad. I didn't hear of any celebrations. That's another point I should make. At that point, the women's movement as a whole was not particularly focused on finances. They were focused on other issues, and I even had got to know Gloria Steinem really well later. I was an editor at Ms. Magazine, a contributing editor. And when I started there, I was the first person at Ms. that wrote on finance. And I asked Gloria about it. I did a long interview with her that's actually in the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe, where it was transcribed and put in there. And Gloria said she didn't think about money. She just expected she'd be organizing bag ladies when she was old. And that particular point of view pervaded a lot of the points of the women's movement because everybody thought money was not a female topic. They were still not seeing that it was a female topic. Now, of course, we understand that it's a very much a female topic, but that was just another era.
Hmm. Were you aware of the sort of rise of women's banks?
I'm aware of that, yes, but it wasn't the center of the universe for me personally. I knew those people at different points or met some of them. I did get to know them. I mean, it was good work that was done, but it wasn't something that was centered to my life or my understanding of what was needed. Because I thought we needed to have women controlling the big banks. I tended to think in those global terms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um,
That doesn't mean that it wasn't good work. It just means
Right.
I thought differently.
Right. Yeah, no, it was. I've interviewed some of them and it's really interesting.
What's interesting to you?
Oh, just, well, the way that they were reflecting on that legislation can't change everything all at once. And so there was still this need for people who would take women seriously when they walked into a bank and tried to get a loan. And there was a need for, like you were doing also, kind of education in financial literacy, and the women's banks tried to do some of that also. And then also the way some of them just reflected back on, that they were not like, well, bra burners or, big time feminist activists, but actually they were doing this work that was contributing in its own way. And it wasn't sort of seen as part of the feminist movement, but now they feel, looking back, that that they were contributing to that.
Oh, sure, they were.
Yeah.
And actually, I did business with a woman's bank in Santa Monica. We had one too later. This was much later. And they actually did give me a very nice loan. So it's not that they didn't have something good to do, but that bank was born out of the side of another bank, an actual national bank. Somehow, I don't know how they did that exactly, but the woman that led it was very charismatic and very good. And unfortunately, the bank later closed, but they did really well while they were there. I mean, they made money for their investors, but
Right.
the investors wanted to see the end of their time being in a bank.
So Okay, so the ECO passes and then you left and you went back to California, is that right?
Yes, but we didn't get to the part about where we went over to the Senate to get it
Oh,
passed from.
right. All right. Let's tell me that
If you
story.
want that day by day.
I would love to hear it.
Okay. Well, as soon as the law was introduced, which was it was put into the hopper the day that the Senate broke for Easter or spring break. When I came back, now suddenly it was the actual bill being proposed, and I immediately went to work trying to round up Senate support for the bill. And that's when I really got into calling the women in the different offices because I knew that we'd have to get a lot of senators on board, including Democrats and Republicans. And there were no independents in that day that I know of. There were no Bernie Sanders. So, as far as I know, there were just the two parties. Um, so I used the congressional directory, which is a blue book that you get when you go to work in the Congress, and you can look up everybody that works there. It even has their salary. So it showed my measly salary of $5,000 for being a fellow for the whole year, and I could find the women that would probably have the most sway, almost by their salaries. And I just started calling them and telling them what we were doing and asking for their support. And I got a lot of sponsors signed onto the bill over the period of time between uh, the introduction of the bill, which I think was late April or mid-April, and the actual day of going to the Senate, which was July 23rd.
Do you remember any of those conversations? Did women tell you, like, oh, I've had that same kind of problem? Were they responding personally, or were they just responding like, I think my legislator would or wouldn't be interested?
I think both. I think most women had some experience or secondhand experience with this issue, but also, some of the men senators knew about these problems and some didn't. But people were pretty quickly getting educated. I think it's true that legislation can't change everything, but overnight it changes mores and attitudes in some parts of culture, even though it doesn't touch them directly. I mean, right away people were aware that this was a problem. And the fact that a Republican senator who was considered to be fairly conservative or moderate put it into the hopper meant that it was taken seriously, which is what Bella was upset about.
Yeah, yeah, I can see that.
Oh, on the day that the Senate passage happened, I have to tell this story. The dress code in the Senate was, as I've said before, no pants anywhere. But by that time, I had broken all the other rules about pants and worn my pants all over the place. Actually, our office changed its dress code on account of me, and because they didn't want me to be violating the code, they just changed the code. But by the time I went to the floor with Senator Bright, which would be my only visit to the floor, I was in a white pantsuit, not a pantsuit, one a top and bottom, not with a jacket, just a nice white top and bottom, and platform shoes. I was really dressed up like a California woman, and there I was on the Senate floor in those outfits. And the pants were not allowed on the Senate floor until many, many years later for senators. I don't know about for staffers, but I know that there was an article about this. And sometime in the 80s, they finally changed the rule.
And do you remember how you were feeling that day?
I was really excited. I was really happy. I was very well prepared. I had little talking points created for every single issue anybody might bring up, all ready to run up and give to the senator. But nobody brought up any issues. Nobody wanted to stand up and be against this bill. They just stood up and supported it. And then it passed 97-0 or 98-0. Although in the paper it didn't say that, it said 90-0. In my book I had it wrong too. But in the final issue of the New York Times it said 98-0. I guess the numbers kept coming in like the votes. That's a joke. It's not true. They get the numbers immediately.
Did you celebrate?
No, not really. I don't remember celebrating at all, particularly. I mean, I was probably exhausted by that point. I don't remember anything about that except going to the Senate, riding in the little train thing that you ride around under the ground in, and being with a senator in that. I'd done that a few times to try to get his attention, get information in front of him, but I'd never gone all the way over to the floor. I probably was so exhausted and so exhilarated at the same time. Where I lived was directly across the top of the hill from the Russell office building where our office was. So every day I would walk home by the Supreme Court and the Library of Congress and then down Independence Avenue, I think it was. I can't remember for sure. I lived on East 3rd Street.
Okay, so that passed, and soon after that, you left DC. Is that correct?
Well, this is a whole long story, but basically, right after I did this work, people started telling me I should run for office. And at that time, a lot of people were trying to encourage women to run. And I started thinking about it. And eventually, I went in and talked to Senator Brock about it. What did he think? And there was a seat in my district, the district which I decided would be my district, I should say. I wasn't living there. I wasn't living anywhere in California. I was in Washington. But there was a man that held that seat that was considered to be kind of fairly corrupt. And so they were trying to get me to run in that seat. But I wanted to run in the empty seat, which is the one that, I forgot who had held it before, but Waxman was the one that was aiming for that seat. So I went and met with a woman who became my finance chair. I was extremely lucky to have gotten the biggest woman's donor in the country, woman donor to Democratic politics, Joan Palevsky, as my finance chair. And then I went up to see Waxman and his outfit, Berman and Waxman, and they immediately told me I shouldn't run for that seat because Waxman already had it wrapped up. And they're the ones that wanted me to run for Charlie Wilson's seat. I didn't want to run anywhere there, but anyhow, I did. When I went to talk to the senator, I asked him, should I run as a Democrat or Republican? He said, well, you have Democratic point of view, so you have to run as a Democrat. He said, you can't run far from where your heart is. And that was true. So that's when I decided I have to be a Democrat in life, not just for running for office. But I put together a really good campaign. It was tough. I was in a district that really wasn't suitable to run around as a woman sometimes. I included Compton and other parts of LA area, but it also included Gardena and Hawthorne. It was a nice district, but it was sometimes it was a little difficult. And I ended up getting a nice turnout. Came in second. It was a three-way race, but I didn't win. But I did end up testifying in Congress about my experience and the fundraising experience especially. And after that, they were interested in what happened to me. I guess I turned out I was a record fundraiser for that year for women, which I didn't know. Well, I was very fortunate.
So, were you really disappointed to not? How did you feel when you didn't win?
I was crushed, even though I did think it was a long shot. I had gotten a tremendous amount of support from celebrities. Some of the ones that helped me were Ed Asner, Mariette Hartley, and Kathy Nolan, and others who I can't remember all of them now. But the night when I ended up losing, I didn't do a good job. I could not drag myself out to talk to my supporters. I just completely sort of fell apart. I got pulled back together really quickly, but for some reason I was really down and exhausted. I went to Hawaii right afterwards and got better. I got my campaign manager to go with me, and we just went for a week. And then I sort of restored myself in the ocean.
And did you ever think about running again?
Well, this is the weirdest thing. I found out later that I probably could have won in the California Assembly for the next election because I had won all of the parts that would have been in that district. But by that point, I wasn't 100% sure if I wanted to continue in that path. It had taken a lot out of me, took a lot out of my marriage. It was hard on my mama. Just a lot of things like that. So I finally decided I'm going to move back to the main area of LA where I was more used to, which would be kind of West LA or something, and do something different. I went back to doing more academic type things.
And how did you feel about that?
Well, it was a difficult transition because there are not a lot of job openings for former candidates for Congress, which is what I'd been now labeled as, a former candidate for Congress. So I sort of tried to relabel myself, but I lucked out. I mentioned I had raised money for myself. On account of that, the person who was later became the chairman of the LA Olympics in '84, Paul Zifrin, hired me to help out in the campaign of March Fong Yu, who became Secretary of State. So I went over there and did fundraising for her. And that's how I ended up meeting Gloria, because we had Gloria for 2 events, and one of the events was not going to work out. And so I persuaded them to let me take Gloria and my finance chair to dinner. They'd never met each other, and then that ended up being the biggest supporter of Ms. over the years. So that turned out to be a positive thing. And I got to understand Gloria a little better. I'd seen her at long distance, but not in person. I'd seen her writings and her discussions on TV, but she was really interesting to meet. That was when she was still saying, "This is what 40 looks like," and I was totally shocked that any woman would say she was 40 and admit it.
And then was it after that that you became a contributing editor?
It was a long time after that. This dinner was in 1974, and the Miss thing started in '83, late '83.
Okay.
So it was almost 9 years later. Gloria came on my TV show in the meanwhile.
Yes, I've read about your TV show, so tell me more about that.
Well, according to USA Today, I was the first woman financial host on TV, which I think was true. And I had did 26 segments for Lifetime. When Lifetime started rolling out, they thought they were going to be more of a service channel for women. They didn't really think they were going to be a movie channel. So my segments were installed in another thing that ran a couple hours every day, aimed at women, and I basically worked on first selling the program, and then once it was sold, which took a lot of work, I even flew to France to go around one of the big conferences there, television conferences, in Cannes. But anyway, I got it sold, and I had to basically sold it to ABC. Hearst didn't appear at that table. It was just one of the investors. It was Hearst and ABC did that Lifetime together, or did own. I don't know if they bought it out. Then I had to figure out what each segment was going to be about, find out how to read a teleprompter, because they insisted I had to read one even though I didn't need to. Practice on that, pull together all the elements like the guest. That's when I started using my contacts and get really good guests. I had Geraldine Ferrara and Gloria and all kinds of other people. It was a lot of work to do a TV show. I didn't understand at the time that if you did one show on cable, you couldn't do another one for 3 years. That was what the contract said. I only found that out once I'd finished doing the show. They never came up with a contract till the show was finished. That's sort of typical in the entertainment industry. There was a verbal contract and there was agents talking, but I never really understood that till after we did the show. But when I found that out, then I immediately turned around to do other things.
So what were the other things?
I don't know. No, I do know. I do know what I did. It took me about a year to figure out what I was doing. Let me think. What year was that? 84, 83? I think I went over to USC and started a women's credit project. That's what I did.
And so what does it mean to start the Women's Credit Project at USC? What was the project?
Go raise money.
Okay.
The usual steps when you deal with USC. Come with your money on hand, and then make a negotiation that they won't take a percentage of the money, because it wasn't very much money, and then start. Actually, I think I did that before I did the show. I have to look at my resume to remember the years at this point. I must have done that before I went to, no, let's see. Did I do the show after or before Harvard? I graduated from the Kennedy School in 1981. Okay, so I did the show after I did that stuff. I don't know what I did right after the show. I'll have to think about that.
That's okay.
Oh, I started writing a book. This book here, let me show you. I don't remember writing books; they just happen. This one I wrote. This was my book I wrote. It was about the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Yeah, and here's a picture of how I would look if I were only 40 years younger. The point being that that's why I can't remember what I was doing. I was writing books.
Uh-huh. And that it seems like that book did quite well.
It did, and then I got another contract to do the Ms. Money book,
Mm,
which was did well too, did really well. The Wall Street Journal picked it as one of the 10 best books of the year.
that's great. So you were really known at that time as sort of the expert on women and credit and
And money.
money.
I got into being money and not just credit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That was before
and
all
you
the
also
people. There were a lot of people that got into the field later, about the time I finished that writing and moved on to write about something different.
because you also had a project at Harvard.
I did. I had a, yeah, that's why I get confused about my years. I was at USC before I went to Harvard. That's what's confusing. And I took that money that I had raised. Oh, no, I know, I remember now. HUD gave me 2 grants. Donna Shalala, who was the secretary of was she the secretary? No, she was the secretary later. She was the secretary of labor or education later. Donna was at that point was at HUD, and she gave me 2 government grants to study up on the follow up of the Equal Credit Act, and I took the part of that money went through USC, and part of it went with me to Harvard.
Okay.
And Michael Dukakis became the faculty sponsor for that project, and he got me an office and all the different other things I needed, like stamps. And I went around to the TV stations in Boston and explained the credit situation, and then I took calls every afternoon from a certain point. And I got a lot of calls from women all over the place. I got a lot of anecdotal information about what happened with women in credit in that particular place. Uh, and I wrote it up. I don't have a copy of it anymore, but I did write a whole report on it.
So you were doing kind of follow-up research about the state of women in credit after the ECOA.
That's right.
Okay.
So I seem to have done that for several years,
Mm-hmm.
from 73 till about 83 or 81.
When the thing you wrote up at Harvard was that a published article or a report or?
It was a published report in the sense that it was public and it was a report. It wasn't widely circulated. I don't even know what I did with my copy. It's probably in a storage room somewhere. I have a lot of things like that I wrote, and I don't even have the reports I did for HUD, but somebody found them who was trying to interview me about that stuff. So they're somewhere available, but I just didn't get a hold of them. I don't have room to keep that many things in my life now.
Most of your papers are at Tulane, is that right?
Yeah, that's the papers from the work at the Equal Credit Act and my work from the TV show. It's not my papers about everything I ever published.
Hmm.
I failed to send them everything that was ever published. I should have done that, but I haven't done that. I wrote or co-wrote 7 books,
Right.
and they only have the 2 books, I think.
Okay. And so you've done a lot. When you kind of reflect back, was there any other part of your career that we're missing that we should talk about?
So I have to think about that for a second. Well, I became a lawyer. I wasn't a lawyer when I did all this work, and that has been a different part of my career that didn't involve being a teacher anymore. But I also went to Mexico for 13 years and taught in the best university in Monterrey, Mexico, which was a lot of fun. It was a different experience. I taught in English because all the business world uses English to communicate.
What were you teaching?
Business law and business practices and other things around that issue, like cultural topics. We had one class on culture, different cultures. and one on negotiations. I taught different things over those 13 years.
So when you think back on your career, how do you reflect on your legacy?
I don't think of it as a legacy so much as a long period of life taken over by one topic that seems to be continuing now 60 years later. Now that we're at the 60th anniversary of the legislation, it's amazing to me how much time I actually end up spending on the equal credit still. Not that there's necessarily the same problems today. Today, the problems revolve around business credit and the issue of transparency in credit reports, which I don't think we have good transparency, and the fact that people don't understand that there's good debt and bad debt. That's one issue that bothers me a lot, because all of the reports that come out tell about how much money people owe on their credit cards, but they don't tell what people did with the money they owed, or how if you don't have a mortgage you can't buy a house. People kind of understand that now, but for a long time that was another issue for women, and men too, actually, everybody who didn't fall into certain financial categories. I saw an article about that just recently. There's a lot of people now that are looking at this proposal that the Democrats have made about a down payment on a house. Supposedly there's a thing in California that's going to offer something like that. We'll see. But
What
it's
is the
something needed.
proposal?
Well, Vice President Harris has proposed the $25,000 down payment available. I don't know what the criteria are for who will get it, but probably there's an income limit, or an asset limit or something. But it's to start generational wealth. Now in California that wouldn't go very far, but there's some places where 25 would do for a down payment,
Mm-hmm.
and there are people that live in areas that would be happy to have that.
Are there currently issues around money and finances and credit that you think are still highly gendered or, particularly relevant to women? Or is it now, there are these problems about good credit and bad credit, but they're more broadly distributed?
I think the biggest thing that bothers me when I watch television is the number of ads they have for people worried about their lives because they have a bad credit report, or they have no credit report, or they don't have a good enough credit report. And what bothers me is I don't think there's any transparency in the construction of the FICO scores, which are the main type of construction they have, the three main credit agencies use to figure out whether you're credit worthy. And that's like a black box because we don't really know what goes into the credit history report. We only know that we have good or bad credit, and we get some hints because if you change something in your report, you can find out how that was affecting your report. But nobody has the time to sit down and figure all this out. And I guess the argument against giving out the information is that people would use it to the detriment of the creditors because they would try to fit in what the creditors wanted. But then on the other hand, if you don't know what the criteria are, how are you going to ever get the job or the credit? You got to know what that is. So I think there should be more transparency around that issue. And if somebody would propose it, I think they'd be interested in that. Maybe it's a good topic for the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau.
Yeah. Is there one particular thing that you're most proud of about
My
your own work?
son, my son, I have a son who's just turned 40, and my life certainly changed when he came into it. And you end up spending a lot of your time and mental effort and of thinking about your children. I don't go any minute probably without thinking about him. So I guess I'm really proud of having had a son that I can love.
Is he local in DC?
He's California, but not local. He's about 200 miles from where I live. So, no, 100, I'm sorry, 120 miles. Think of it as 2 hours. It's more than 2 hours. But he comes down as much as he can, and he's been really good about helping me. I'm now in a physical rehabilitation center. Oh, now you hear a roommate coughing. That's not that. I think that's signaling the end of our interview.
All right. Well, is there anything that you wanted to talk about that I didn't give you a chance to talk about?
Well, I should tell you that it's okay to be 82, although it's not the most favorite place I've ever been. I've certainly survived, and I can sit here and talk with some degree of clarity. even though I might not be able to run up there and see you.
Yeah. Well, you have a remarkable memory for dates and details, and I so appreciate you taking the time to share your remarkable story with us. I really,
Thank
it's
you.
wonderful.
Thank
Yeah.
you very much.